following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners on Saga 960 AM and those listening around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. Tonight, I'm trying something different. No guests, no callers, just fundamentals work based on listener writing questions, because tonight we're talking about boundaries, so I'm setting some boundaries for this show. As I said last week, boundaries are our emotional and physical property lines. Some boundaries are flexible, some aren't, and everyone's boundaries are different. No one has the right to set personal boundaries for another adult. That's why one of my top 10 sayings is, others don't have to like your boundaries, but they do have to respect them. I'm big on boundaries. And the thing is, the idea of respecting boundaries is when people say, yes, you have to respect boundaries. You need to set boundaries. But so many people really don't understand what this means. It's a process involving 3 parts. Listening when someone sets a boundary, making sure you understand what the person means by the boundary, and respecting when someone lets you know that you've crossed a boundary. You got to get all 3 to truly respect boundaries. Simple, fundamental beginning of this. Always, always, always respect no or stop. It doesn't matter why someone's saying no or stop. You don't have to like it. You don't have to like the no or stop. You don't even have to think it's being said in good faith. You can think someone's being manipulative, devious, unfair, but when someone says no or stop, it means no. It means stop. This sounds so simple and so common sense, but I watch people blow through boundaries all the time. And let's face it, we all have stories of telling someone that something bothered us and them not taking us seriously, or worse, getting more aggressive about that thing that bothered us. These are traumatic experiences that can stay with a person their entire life. If it happens enough, someone may feel like they don't deserve to set boundaries in the first place, or that they're not good enough at enforcing them to bother. I hear way too often from my private clients justifications for why someone busted a boundary. I wasn't clear enough. I wasn't forceful enough. I didn't totally hate it. They were just kidding around. And I get really concerned when I hear statements like this, because another top 10 saying, ignoring negatives isn't being positive. If it only happens once or twice, a boundary violation is not the end of the world. Mistakes happen. People sometimes get distracted. They don't pay close enough attention. People can forget sensitivities, well-meaning people, or they get confused. But when a person repeatedly busts boundaries, or worse, when they get aggressive in response to being informed that they violated a boundary, that's a sign of a pretty serious problem. Now, this may sound weird to you. The idea might even make you uncomfortable, because various family cultures are defined by a lack of boundaries. And that's not cultures as we think like international cultures. I mean, the culture of your own family. It can be a symptom of intergenerational trauma. And it can be really difficult for everyone involved when a person starts setting new boundaries. I mean, go watch Encanto. It's kind of about that. But boundaries are extremely important because boundaries allow us to moderate and regulate our emotional responses. A person with weak personal boundaries often has trouble respecting the boundaries of other people. That makes sense, right? It's not really their fault. They don't know. But those people tend not to be very happy people. And that's because boundaries are essential to healthy self-concept, self-esteem, a stable identity, and an ability to feel safe. Some people are never allowed to form boundaries due to childhood abuse or neglect. Other people have their boundaries torn down as an adult by abuse at home or work, or because they're a victim of violence. It's harder to form boundaries in unsafe environments like high crime neighborhoods. Poverty is also shown to be a factor in a lack of healthy boundaries for various reasons. Then there are factors like disabilities, mental health challenges, addiction, experiences with racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Happy Pride, everyone, by the way. These can all wear down boundaries, and some people are sick of hearing the woke stuff, but it's true. At this point, some of you might be wondering if it's even possible for the vast majority of people to have healthy boundaries. I'm not going to lie to you. It can be hard. It takes work. I had to face my lack of solid boundaries in trauma therapy. And it took me a long time to realize that I thought I had healthy boundaries, but I actually didn't. My sense of self had been impacted by what was really boundary-busting behavior. People in my life defining me as difficult, unpleasant, annoying, antisocial, selfish, and ungrateful. And it was because I was attempting to set limits on how much I was willing to take. They got angry. They expressed disappointment. Some of them even stopped talking to me. Many of you listening right now have probably been called something similar to that list I just racked off. It hurts, right? Because it cuts to the core of our self-image. Culturally, personally, we see selflessness, agreeableness, and likability as virtues. Everybody likes to be those things, right? The thing about selflessness, agreeableness, likability, these qualities are all highly subjective. Many of my private clients struggle with setting boundaries because of these negative definitions forced on them by others. My advice to them is lean into the accusation. Hear me out. If the person calling you selfish really thought you were selfish, why would they expect you to care that they're calling you selfish? No one's perfect, right? So if your mother, spouse, or other close contact is pulling these verbal control levers, let them. Because what more can they call you when you act more quote unquote selfish? More selfish? Selfisher? Super selfish? More annoying? More unlikable? Think about this. How selfless and likable is that person who goes around name calling and nagging people like that? It's the proverbial pot calling the kettle black, right? Top 10 saying, no one can relate to perfect people. Stop trying to be perfect. Your entire character is not summed up by someone else's judgment of a single action on your part. Maybe you were having a selfish moment. That doesn't make you a selfish person. Another top 10 saying. This is why my top 10 sayings are top 10 sayings. We're going to get a whole chain of them here, okay? Self-esteem cannot exist without self-compassion. If you aren't kind to yourself, you'll be extremely vulnerable to the cruelty of others. Healthy goals are based on things you can control. You can't control the stuff your mom says, or your spouse says, or your sister says, or your brother says, or your father says, or your kid says, okay? They're probably the exact same knee-jerk things that other people said to them that controlled them. And that's where we go to another top 10 saying, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. Yeah, your dad can be way too pushy and try to run your life for you. Your mom's always nagging you about something. Don't let them goad you into making reactive decisions that end up hurting you in the long run. Another top 10 saying, be the hero of your own story and not anyone else's. Hurt people, right? Maybe you can save them. Maybe you can't. But if you're drowning, you're not going to be able to keep anyone else afloat. If someone blows up or stops talking to you because you set a boundary, ask yourself, is this really a healthy relationship? I was really scared to confront that in my past, but I'm better off now putting those relationships where they belong and identifying them for what they are. Because as I said last week, you can't just will yourself into being able to handle more than you can handle. You may think it's selfless to continue to push yourself until you drop, but it's really not. Over the long run, when you're constantly worn out, raw, and exhausted, you're less productive, more irritable, more likely to get sick, and less likely to make the best choices. Professional athletes and performers understand the importance of staying healthy and avoiding overtraining. If peak performance types know that there's such thing as too much, then it's complete arrogance for the rest of us to think that we can keep overloading ourselves and then expect good results. So let's dig in, right? How do we set boundaries? How do we assess them to make sure they're working for us? How do we enforce them when someone starts pushing us? And more on respecting other people's boundaries. All that when we come back from this break with some questions from listeners. If you want to ask a question, we're not taking calls tonight, but you can leave a message, 289-275-9600. Leave a message. We'll use it on a future show. Or email me your question, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. That's Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Or real simple, you can send me a message at nottherapyshow on Twitter and Instagram. We'll be back in a few talking boundaries on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy talking boundaries. Specifically how to set and reset boundaries right now, because we're going to dive in with a question from Alex, somebody who emailed a question in. If you want to email in a question, email Liana at nottherapyshow.com, Liana at nottherapyshow.com, or send it Twitter, Instagram at nottherapyshow. All right. Alex says, this question is about setting boundaries several years into a romantic relationship. How do you do that without breaking anything? Is it even possible? Here's a concrete example. I'm sitting at my computer listening to your show with my earphones in, and my partner asked me a question from the other room. I hear enough to know she spoke, but not what she said, and I was focused anyway. So I asked her to repeat what she said. She got upset that I'm isolating myself, which makes it hard to talk to me, even though I immediately paused the podcast and shifted my attention to her. The way I see it, she expects me to be available to a level that I don't like. But I certainly contributed to build that expectation in the first few years of our relationship. How do I backtrack on something like this in a way that she can agree with? So far, proposing that she first catch my attention, then say what she wants to say has not worked. This question can extend to any expectation that's been built but does not work anymore. All right, Alex, great question. There are two parts to the answer, okay? Respecting your partner's boundaries first and foremost, and setting and enforcing yours. The two things work together. Respecting other people's boundaries makes enforcing your own a lot easier. This is part of the motivation for my top 10 saying. We're racking them off tonight. Listen twice before you talk once. I'm probably going to be saying this a lot tonight. Listen twice before you talk once. Now, this is what I heard listening multiple times, reading your question multiple times. You said, she gets upset that you're isolating yourself, which makes it hard to talk to you. Which, you're right, is about expectations, but it's also about a desire to communicate, to feel heard and connect. That's what I heard. So there's a few things that might be going on here. Either there's not enough structured time for you two to really connect to each other without devices causing distractions, or there isn't enough time carved out where it's agreed that you get to tune into the podcast and videos you like. Or it's a combination of both. That's something you can explore based on common core values. That's why my top 10 saying about relationships is core values are more important for relationships than common interests. With that said, let's get to the core of your question. Basically, how do you get her to agree to a new boundary regarding headphones time that you're comfortable with? I'm not going to guarantee anything, okay? But you can maximize your chances by starting communication with those core values. Here's an example. You're very important to me, and I never intend to upset you because I can't hear you over the headphones. I do really want to listen to what you're saying because I really value this relationship, and I'm sorry I'm coming across as hard to talk to. Now, starting with that validation helps a lot. Whatever you do, if you're going to include an I'm sorry in there, don't say something like, I'm sorry you feel I'm hard to talk to. Never, ever apologize for someone else's feelings. More on that in a future episode, okay? I'm big on sincere apologies because they de-escalate. Some people have trouble with apologizing because it feels like weakness or backing down, but yeah, that's the whole idea. You're backing down. That's de-escalation. Okay, let's move on, okay? Next step, after you've done the validation, is to give something of yourself. Again, the question is, how do I not break things? How do I get her to agree? This is a question I'm answering. So you're building an agreed upon foundation now. Now I'm going to take a bit of a guess. I'm going to speculate here based on some inferences. Again, I'm listening twice before I talk once. Again, this is just an example of something you could say. I don't know if it suits your situation, but I'm putting myself in here because I am an introvert, right? I need my gaming time and stuff like that. So, okay. You know I'm an introvert, so I need time with my own thoughts to depressurize. Listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos is one way I do that. The podcast I was listening to was one I listened to improve myself. I know that dealing with introversion can be a real challenge sometimes, so I'd like to find a way to make it clear in advance that I'm going to have headphones on and for how long. I also want to know how to reassure you that I do care what you're saying. Sometimes I'm just in my own head. That's what I'd say again. Make it your own. It's very important to make it your own and not have something sound bad rehearsed. A mistake people often make when they're setting boundaries in a relationship is making too many boundaries one-sided instead of making it a give and take. That's why I used the example of a property line last week. Your property line can also be your neighbor's property line. That property line is essentially an agreement, right? You can't just put up a fence wherever you want. If your tree grows over to a neighbor's yard, they have the right to trim the tree, at least the branches on their side of the property line, right? But they can't just cut down the whole tree on your side of the property line. Does that make sense, that metaphor? The combined solution to this boundary issue, the tree overlapping the property line, should be something you come up with together as opposed to an edict from one partner or the other. You know, maybe it can be a Post-it note on the door, some other visual signal, right? It could be set times for podcasting, video viewing, a time at night where, okay, you know, with some exceptions, it goes off now. We spend time now. That protected time is really important. The details don't matter as much as her being a part of the process and setting the boundary, right? If she feels like she's part of the process and setting the boundary, she's going to feel less like she's being forced to do something she doesn't want to do. Shared property line again. What this does is what you asked, Alex. Maximizing your chances that she'll agree to the change, right? People don't agree to things when they feel like they're being forced. Because when someone feels like they're being forced, no one asks them, right? They certainly don't feel like their agreement is essential. It's being forced down your throat. And this is one of the big problems with how media depicts boundaries, right? It's that stereotype of putting your foot down. And yeah, okay, sometimes you do have to do that if someone is really taking advantage. That's more of an enforcement of boundaries, though. Putting your foot down isn't the most effective way of setting a boundary in the first place without, as you say, Alex, breaking something. The best boundaries are set and validated in calm, safe, loving conversations. They make the other person feel welcomed in instead of shut out. And I admit there's an art as well as a science to that. It takes practice to figure out what's going to work best with a particular person, because everybody's different. Everyone has different sensitivities. Everyone has different needs. Everyone has different core values. And so everyone has different boundaries. But the components tend to be the same. And I'll repeat them again because we've been talking for a while. Validate the importance of the other person to you and the shared core values, the value in your relationship, the value in a goal, the value in, protecting something, whatever it is, something shared that you can validate. Then give something of yourself to let the other person in, and then work together to collaborate on creating a mutually agreed upon boundary. It's the opt-in, as we say in marketing. Now, this is especially important in your particular situation, Alex, when you're changing where a boundary is. And that, it happens in long-term relationships of all kinds, not just romantic partners, families of origin, families of choice, friends, coworkers, employers, any situation where you've known each other for a really long time. Things change and you have to check in and adjust, right? And like I said, this isn't a guarantee. Ideally, both partners have to be proficient in boundary-related skills for this to work, and I have no idea what your partner's skills or experience is in this regard. But you asked how to minimize the chances of breaking anything, and this is the best way to do it. Remember, you're not laying down the law. It's more drawing up a contract. Not only does consensus make boundary setting easier, it's going to make enforcing those boundaries easier down the road. Because again, when boundaries are too one-sided in a relationship, the other party feels frozen out, like they're not a priority, like they're being forced, like they're being stifled. It can lead to a lot of resentment and a breakdown of the stuff that brought you guys together in the first place. And the things that are good about the two of you together. A boundary isn't a rule. If it were, we'd call it a rule, right? A happy life doesn't come with firm rules, no matter how many self-help books try to tell you that it does. Here's a one weird trick to life, okay? The more control you demand, the less control you end up having. Because you're squeezing too tight and stomping all over other people's boundaries in the process of enforcing your very rigid rules. Healthy boundaries are kind of like human rights that way. The proverbial yours end where another person's begin. Healthy boundaries factor in an element of flexibility. For instance, letting the neighbor's kid hop the fence to get their ball back, inviting the neighbors over for a barbecue, stuff like that. Now, anybody who's had neighbors know that those friendly exchanges can only happen when you're reasonably certain that this neighbor isn't going to take too many liberties with those privileges. It's still your property. It's still your house. They're guests. Sharing your life with someone does mean that many of those boundaries, many of those property lines directly abut their property line. They put pressure on your partner's boundaries. That's the big challenge and the big reward of long-term close relationships, personally and professionally. That's what makes them so powerful and so fulfilling when they work and so painful when they don't, right? So I'm going to speculate a little bit more and suggest your partner probably doesn't want you to feel uncomfortable in terms of availability, right? She doesn't want you to feel put out. She just wants to know when and how she can rely on you to be available, right? That reassurance, that safety, that comfort. That's what boundaries do. They provide a sense of safety and comfort. And that compromise is really doable if you follow the steps I set out. Again, repeating, because this is important. Validate the importance of the other person to you. Shared core values. Give something of yourself to let the other person in. Work together to create a mutually agreed upon boundary. I'm repeating this again and again because it's a great question, Alex. A great way to kick off the Q&A part of the show. And thanks for being a fan, even if it caused some temporary conflict. Now, I'm sure Alex's question generated a lot more questions. So if you have a question, we can always circle back to boundaries in future weeks. 289-275-9600 if you prefer to leave a message. Or you can email Liana at nottherapyshow.com, LIANA@nottherapyshow.com, or send me a tweet. Connect on Instagram at nottherapyshow. We got to take a break, another break. When we come back, how to set those use very sparingly one-way boundaries, how to respect the boundaries of others, and how to enforce boundaries when someone is trying to bust them. Right after this quick break on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We are back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I think I am. Yes, I am. I know I am still not a therapist. We're talking about boundaries tonight. And before the break, we talked about negotiated shared boundaries, give and takes in relationships. Now we're going to dive in to the hopefully short list that you have of those no compromise, do not pass go boundaries that everyone has or everyone should have. A listener named Mike emailed me to ask, how do you know if a boundary is fair or proper? And that's a great question, Mike, especially with those one-way do not pass go boundaries. A boundary should never be used to control another person. It's really important that your boundaries don't demand perfection from others because perfection isn't possible. You're just setting them up to fail and you're setting yourself up for disappointment. But there are certain things, violence, infidelity, dishonesty, bringing intoxicating substances or allergens into a house or car. All of these things are completely fair subjects for non-negotiable boundaries because they impact your health, mental and physical. Personal example, I'm allergic to marijuana, like really allergic to marijuana. I'm allergic to all kinds of grass and a ton of trees, but marijuana is bad. I know you stoners out there are weeping for me right now, or you're chill because you're stoned, but I get really, really sick when exposed to weed. If someone gives me an edible without telling me as a joke, it's not funny. And yet there are people who think it's funny. They think that's okay to do. It's not okay to do. Somebody doses me, that's a relationship ender. I don't care what relationship it is. Somebody else might be totally fine if their friend switches out gummy bears for pot gummies, but it could kill me. So people who think that's a practical joke cannot be in my life. Everyone has the right to set boundaries like this. No exceptions. Everybody has the right to set boundaries like this. Okay? But that means everybody has the right to set boundaries. So back to the fairness question, Mike. A fair boundary doesn't extend beyond yourself. For instance, going back to my own example, I can't go to concerts, and it sucks because I love live music, but I can't because concerts are pot smoke central. Am I going to demand that everyone else I know stop going to concerts? No, of course not. That's not a fair boundary. Make sense? Another rule of thumb, it's sort of saying the same thing in a different way, is this. A boundary should not compel action from someone else. Now, there are exceptions to this, but hear me out. Like I said, rule of thumb, not firm rule for life. I don't like being called this is really different from you must call me this, right? You can't force other adults to do things. You can ask, but you can't force them. A request is not a boundary, right? Now, yeah, okay, you're thinking out there, sometimes boundaries do require active things from others, right? Something like, please put your laundry in the hamper. I don't want to have to pick up your dirty underwear. Now, why is this fair based on not compelling action from other people? Well, because that boundary is about the other person not forcing you to pick up their dirty underwear. You see how it works? You see how the interplay works? Another layer. Any boundary that's based on the basic needs of life is fair to set. Hence my ganja boundary, right? I don't want to risk that. If someone's doing something that's impairing your ability to get enough sleep, take care of your health, exercise regularly, or even something like your ability to get to work or school on time, right? That matters. Setting that boundary there is totally fair. Similar to what I said to Alex before the break, you have a right to set a reasonable amount of personal space, personal time, and personal property. Reasonable, right? Oh, there's that word, reasonable. Yeah. Reasonable is a problem word because reasonable means different things to different people. It's subjective. But some basic common sense does apply. A whole house that you share with someone isn't all your personal space, right? You don't get to control all of it. But maybe one room or a portion of a room is something that can just be yours and isn't a negotiation, right? You see how that works? You don't have the whole thing. You have your piece of the whole thing that's yours, right? Again, that sort of thing should come out of negotiations, not laying down the law, right? We're jumping to work boundaries now, Mike, because these are really tough. Personal boundaries are a little easier because it's a relationship of equals, especially between two adults. The teenage years are difficult because it's an ongoing change of boundaries, right? Teenagers want more and more freedom. They may not agree with their parents on how much freedom they should get, how fast, right? That's why the teenage years, among other things, are so difficult. I love working with teenagers because it's chaos. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about now. Work boundaries. Work boundaries are tough. They're really difficult to assess because of all the different subjective variables that come into workplaces. I mean, shining example is the recent passage of the right to disconnect law here in Ontario. For people listening from outside of Ontario, yeah, the government actually had to make a law so that bosses and colleagues have to respect workplace hours and non-workplace hours. They actually made a law over this. That's an example of how bad we are as a culture at setting boundaries. The fact that the government had to tell companies of over 25 people, because that's where it cuts off, hey, guess what? People can't work all the time. People can't always be reachable. They have the right to unplug every so often. It's not really surprising. We all know this. But we've lost sense, I think, of how really not right that is, how messed up that is, and not in the cool teenager messed up way, in the adulting should not suck this bad way, right? Here's in my private peer counseling work, I have some boundaries. There aren't that many, because it's about giving other people tools, but I do have some that are non-negotiable. First one, I am not a crisis service. When people fill out the intake form, that's the first thing they're told. I agree that this is not a crisis service. Here's the numbers to call if you're in crisis. You've heard the disclaimers that this is not personal therapy all over this show. Every break, you hear it, right? Call 211. To access social services. Therapy's there for a reason, okay? The second one, I won't work with people who scream at me. Not only is it not good for me, it's not good for anyone involved. My third rule, and this is the one that catches some people up. All correspondence has to be done through particular channels. I gave a client my personal cell phone number once. Huge mistake. It defines the relationship. Personal cell phone numbers are for friends. People use them at all hours. Lesson learned on my part. Hard lesson. If someone finds these boundaries don't work for them, that's fine. That means I'm not a good fit for them. Boundaries are great that way because they let people know quickly if something meets their needs or not. I'm sure some people are listening and thinking, oh, you should be there for your clients. You should respond to them in any way they want. Cell phone, email, whatever. And sometimes there's a place for that. But I stand by that boundary. That's not me. It didn't work out. And this is the difference between fair and, well, universal to everybody. And we're going to talk more about that in the rest of this show. But right now, Mike, for now, hopefully that gives you some guidance. Thanks so much for your brief but very good question. If you want to ask a question, leave me a message at 289-275-9600. That is not my personal cell phone number. Or you can email me at liana@nottherapyshow.com. Liana, Liana @nottherapyshow.com, or Twitter, Instagram @nottherapyshow. I'm going to pivot to respecting other people's boundaries now. Okay. Reasonable boundaries respect the boundaries of other people. That's the best way I can define reasonable, because otherwise, again, so subjective, so difficult. Just like other people don't have to like your boundaries, but they do have to respect them, you have to respect boundaries of others that you don't like. Respecting boundaries means first being aware of them, which is hard if you grew up in a boundary-busting home. The people around you might also be not good at communicating their boundaries, or they might even know what they are. They might even, what's a boundary? This is why I said early in the show, listen twice before you talk once. Let me give you an example from my own life last week. I have a friend, his name's Tank Boy. No, really, I have a friend whose name's Tank Boy. Okay, it's a nickname, but still, okay. He's ex-military, he's goth, he's a great guy. Tank Boy is one of my sit rep friends. That's what we call those of us who are PTSD supports for each other. A Tank Boy gets real triggered over politics. Sometimes he's okay, but sometimes he's not. Well, we just had an election here. Aren't you glad that's over? Wow, okay. And I forgot about the political sensitivity. And Tank Boy had to go for a walk to calm down. When he came back, I immediately apologized for forgetting about that sensitivity. And he insisted it was okay because he tries to be an easygoing guy. He's great. But I said, no, I'm going to do better going forward. And that meant a lot to him. It ended up bringing us closer together as friends. He told me he felt safe. And that's what respecting and validating boundaries does. They're great. Boundaries are great. Boundaries are good for you. They're like vitamins for friendships. Whatever you do when it comes to this stuff, don't tell someone they're being stupid or selfish or overreacting in response to you accidentally stepping on a boundary. Okay, don't do that. Don't do that. You may not be able to totally accommodate someone all of the time. It's just not possible. None of us is perfect. The point is to sincerely try. And by sincerely try, I mean like real sincere trying. Not that kind of trying, if I whimper long enough, mom will do it for me kind of trying. No. Sincerity has to be sincere. All right, that was long, but I thought it was important to stay on that because it does tie into Mike's question. We're going to go to break and we're going to come back. Final segment, we're going to talk that long-awaited enforcing boundaries. We're finally going to get to that on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back talking boundaries and specifically promised the whole show talking about enforcing boundaries. Now, this was something one time I was really, really bad at. I was really, really bad at this, okay? A truth I really struggled accepting is the truth that you train people how to treat you. I repeat, you train people how to treat you. A lot of us are taught the old saying, do unto others as you would have done unto you, right? The old golden rule. It's not one of my top 10 sayings for a reason, okay? Because it doesn't work. Everybody doesn't want the same things. An older version of that golden rule, it comes from the Talmud, attributed to the elder Hillel, is actually more accurate. And it'll sound really similar, but it's not the same, okay? What is hateful unto you, do not do to your neighbor. This may sound like the same thing, but it's not, and it's central to enforcing boundaries. Here's how. Do unto others as you would have done unto you creates a paradigm where people give and give and give endlessly, hoping to receive the same give and give and give in return in kind. Because we want other people to give us stuff, right? So we give stuff. And yet anyone who lives that way knows that there are just some people who don't give and give and give. They take and take and take. And we hate that. And that's where Hillel's version of the golden rule comes in. Would we want our friends and loved ones to just give to us and give and give and give, getting nothing in return? Well, no, of course not. No considerate person wants that. That's awful. Someone would really resent that and think you're a schnorrer or a gunif, right? So why are you doing it to yourself? This is my Hillel impression. It's terrible, okay? Talmudic wisdom is wisdom for a reason. The modern golden rule creates relationships where people are trying to anticipate needs and mind read. The Talmudic version, on the other hand, is basically stop being a schmuck. Stop being a schmuck basically means set and reinforce your boundaries. Because no one likes someone who doesn't say cut it out at the time that is full of resentment later, right? We all know those people. They don't tell you what's wrong. They're clearly upset. And you ask them why they're upset. They say nothing. You know it's not nothing, right? You hate that. So don't do it to other people. Don't walk around resenting because you can't set boundaries. By enforcing boundaries, by saying what's bothering you, by saying what line was crossed, you're cutting down on that resentment. So long term, you're helping the people around you and forging stronger bonds with those people. But effectively enforcing boundaries, effectively enforcing boundaries isn't about yelling at each other like Miracle Max and his wife in The Princess Bride. If you haven't seen that movie, watch The Princess Bride. Effectively enforcing boundaries means not rewarding busting the boundary. Whoa, double negative. Okay, here's an example. If you do that again, I'm hanging up the phone, right? Boundary set. If they do it again, hang up the phone. Because if you don't, they know next time that you're bluffing. So they're more likely to push, not less. By saying, I'm going to hang up if you do it again, and then you don't, you're rewarding the boundary busting. Next time, they're even more sure that they can push you around. Enforcing boundaries is a form of honesty. So if you're feeling mean, you're not being mean. It's a kindness. Enforcing boundaries is about keeping your word regarding what you say you're going to do. Let's use a more complicated example, going back to something off the beginning of the show, going back to that mom calling you selfish thing. If anyone calls you selfish and you don't think it's fair, make it really clear that mom or anyone else, you're not going to do what they're demanding if they call you selfish. Don't lose it. Don't get mad. Don't yell like Miracle Max and his wife. Just, I love you. I'm not a selfish person. This isn't good for our relationship. So if you call me selfish, I'm going to walk away instead of doing what you want. They're going to do it again. I guarantee you they will do it again. They will call you selfish again because it's an ingrained habit. So keep your word. Walk away. She starts screaming, don't respond in kind. Don't respond. A boundary buster doesn't learn anything through screaming and yelling. If they did, they wouldn't bust boundaries because people tend to get upset where their lines are crossed. Don't get me wrong here. Boundary busters don't like being yelled at. They just get used to being yelled at, and they use getting yelled at to justify further boundary busting. You're yelling, you're mean, look, I have to, right? The only thing that makes a boundary buster change their ways is if they don't get what they want through the boundary busting behavior. That's the only effective way to enforce boundaries. There are no shortcuts. There are no alternatives. Sorry. I know it's not easy at first, but it is simple. At first, this is going to feel foreign, okay? With time, it'll get easier. I motivated myself in the early days by invoking Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. You know that meme? You shall not pass. The line is actually, you cannot pass, but the meme became, you shall not pass. I'm not sure what happened there. And, okay, after that, Gandalf ended up, the Balrog went, wow, and Gandalf ended up falling into the chasm with the Balrog, and then he got burned by the Balrog's fire, and then he almost froze to death and wandered around, and then he did die and need to be resurrected, but technically the Balrog did not pass, and that is epic boundary enforcement. And none of this is relevant to my central point. I just nerded, except it kind of is. Enforcing boundaries sometimes hurts. Sometimes it hurts a lot, but it's better than the alternative because boundary violations hurt worse than the pain of enforcing a boundary in the long term. And they don't just hurt you. I mean, what was Gandalf doing? He was trying to protect the other members of the Fellowship from the Balrog, right? Boundary busters don't just hurt you. They hurt the people you care about. A person with weak boundaries can be a real liability. Again, you know that person. That person drives you crazy. What is hateful unto you, do not do unto your neighbor. If you don't respect the guy who can't say no, the girl that can't say no, the person who can't say no, don't be that person. All right, that's our show. Next week, we're going to talk about apologies and forgiveness. I think this is a good companion to the boundaries discussion, and maybe there'll be more movie references. Not maybe, there will be more movie references, because I love movie and pop culture references. Yes, no boundaries there. All right, if you want to ask a question about apologies and forgiveness, please leave me a message at 289-275-9600, 289-275-9600, or email me at liana@nottherapyshow.com. That's LIANA@nottherapyshow.com, or send me a tweet, Instagram, nottherapyshow.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm not a therapist. You know what I'm going to say. Final top 10 saying that I didn't get to this week. Crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Thanks for listening.